It's the 21st of May, 1940. Adolf Hitler's shadow looms large over Europe as Nazi forces make rapid advances west towards the English Channel. Luxembourg and the Netherlands capitulate in quick succession. Belgium is on the brink of surrender. To the south, France has all but fallen. Its exhausted troops are bolstered by a contingent of British soldiers reeling from the blitzkrieg onslaught. In the small town of Arras, one of their last remaining garrisons is surrounded by panzer divisions, but, against the odds, holds out. London orders its soldiers to launch a daring counterattack that would unwittingly spook German high command and buy precious time. Time that would be used for Operation Dynamo, better known as Dunkirk. I'm James Hanson. Welcome to History Undone, a history show with a difference, where we explore how the briefest of moments end up shaping our world. Each episode will focus on a different battle from throughout history, but using modern military analysis, we'll examine how split-second tactical decisions at critical junctures tip the balance with dramatic consequences. All you have to do is watch, share, and subscribe to History Undone with James Hanson on YouTube. And today, it's the Battle of Arras, a courageous and seemingly futile attempt to sever the Nazi spearhead into northern France. The first major tank engagement of the Second World War may not be widely known, yet it would prove pivotal in stalling the German advance and saving hundreds of thousands of British lives. Joining me to discuss this are the military historian and researcher at the Tank Museum, Chris Copson, and the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. Welcome to you both. Now, before we dive into the Battle of Arras itself, let's just talk about the state of play in the war in May 1940. As you can see, we've got a map of the whole of Europe in front of us. Dr. Chris Parry, talk us through the state of play.
Well, I think everybody knows by this stage, Germany has absorbed Austria and also Czechoslovakia to the north. They're consolidating their hold on two-thirds of Poland, which they invaded in 1939. And just before the invasion of France, they've preemptively taken over Denmark and Norway as well, because they thought that the British were going to get there first and basically cut them off from their iron ore supplies from Sweden. Should mention also that Italy at this stage is not actually fighting on the same side as the Germans. They come in after the Germans have been successful in France.
And they are starting, Chris Copson, to bring you in, they are starting now to have this blitzkrieg assault on northern France.
They are. I mean, the areas that Chris has just described fell fairly easily, but it's about to get serious because the combined British and French forces in France are going to be a tough nut to crack. Nobody at this point knows how it's going to turn out. It could be another World War I. It could be another lengthy stalemate. But the thing that does make the difference is this thing that we call blitzkrieg. They didn't. The name came in later. They called it Wohnungskrieg or Wohnungsmanöver, maneuver warfare. That is going to make the big difference, as we will see when it comes to the panzer divisions advancing into Belgium and France.
What's interesting, Chris, is if you look at the war objectives early on, all Hitler actually wants to get is airfields in the Netherlands and Belgium, so that he can attack Britain. There are very limited war aims initially, which is quite interesting, I think, before, of course, the plan was changed.
OK, well, let's zoom in now. Let's look at the situation in northern France itself. OK, so in front of us now, we have a new map showing the west of Germany, Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium, crucially as well, northern France. And you'll see we have blocks representing the different armies. So red is Germany, the white blocks are the French, and that's the British in northern France. Chris Copson, to start with you, talk us through what made the German blitzkrieg attack so devastating.
It's a three-part plan. They called it Fall Gelb, Plan Yellow. It is altered because early on there's a bit of drama. A German courier plane lands mistakenly at Mechelen in Belgium, and the aviation plan for the whole thing is picked up. So it's altered, and that's actually what takes the German army to Holland above anything else. So Holland falls very quickly. It's largely mobile forces. And then what is happening is there are 3 German army groups. In the north, Army Group B. In the centre, Army Group A. And then down to the south is Army Group C. This is an element of deception. So they call it the Matador's cloak, or the Sickselschnitt, the sickle cut. The French, in their planning, and there's all this nonsense about, oh, well, they built the Maginot Line to hide behind it. No, that's absolute nonsense. The reason the Maginot Line is built is to persuade the German army, if they want to come and invade, to come through Belgium. Because the French had had World War I fought on their soil, they didn't want that to happen again. So the Maginot Line is a shield to push the German army through Belgium. And that is what the German army is playing on. So Army Group B pushes forward into Belgium. The French and British forces, up to the point where Belgium's invaded, Belgium is neutral, so they can't cross the frontier. But when that's happened, they go forward and they're actually heading in this direction. They're going up to the River Dyle. They could have done 3 things. They could have either gone all the way to the frontier and tried to meet up with the Belgian army. They couldn't do that in time. They could have stood on the French frontier, but that would give the German army far too much leeway. So they push on and they go up to the River Dyle, which is roughly midway across.
And the effectiveness, Dr. Chris Parry, of the Blitzkrieg attack took almost everyone by surprise, including the Germans themselves.
Well, that's true. And the real critical issue, of course, is that they have their panzer elements, the tanks, and also the supporting infantry with them. But all the logistics and quite a lot of the infantry is left way behind. And one of the big neuroses of the German High Command is they'll be attacked between their armoured elements that are up front and what's coming on behind to consolidate and obviously hold territory. And that prevails in the minds of the senior German generals throughout. Even Hitler himself is worried about it. He's constantly asking, what is happening at the front line? How close are the troops? And just thinking about it, you look at the detail, for example, 45% of this army is over 40. The Germans aren't using many vehicles. The French have 300,000 vehicles. The Germans have 120,000 because they don't have much fuel. So they're using 2.3 million horses to support this attack. So you can see how nervous the Germans are about it. And they're concerned, of course, that they're going to get bogged down and they're going to have another repeat of the First World War, and they know how that ended.
And we're going to zoom in again in just a moment and focus specifically on the Battle of Arras, which is here on the map. Chris Copson, just talk us through exactly what the state of play was in terms of where the Germans were on that day, on the 21st of May. Where would they have been?
So, Army Group B has come forward into Belgium and is engaging British and French forces. Army Group C feints against the Maginot Line. That's not serious offensive. It's really just to keep the French divisions down there fixed in place. But what's interesting is what's happening in the middle, because in 3 places, at Sedan, at Monterme and at Dinant, panzer troops cross the river Meuse. And the one we're really interested in is 15th Panzer Corps, and especially the 7th Panzer Division.
And that's our old friend Rommel again.
That is commanded by Erwin Rommel. Now, it's quite an unusual command for him because he's never actually led armoured troops before. In the First World War, he had a stunning career, got the blue max around his neck, chased the Italians all over the place at Caporetto. But he gets this command because, really, Hitler has met him and likes him. So you've got an infanteer being given a plum job as commander of one of only 10 panzer divisions, which is kind of unusual. 7th Panzer crosses the Meuse under fairly light opposition because they're up against the French 9th Army. The 9th Army is, to be honest, it's not a frontline unit. They're not expecting anybody to come through the Ardennes. So they're not exactly frontline troops. They're not the best. And they're commanded by a guy called André Corap, and his main military experience is defending forts against the Bedou in North Africa, so he's not exactly on top of the job either. They punch across the Meuse, and then they move very swiftly inland, and there's a series of engagements. At a place called Flavion, 5th and 7th Panzer destroy a French armoured division, the 1st French armoured division. That is actually the first major tank engagement of the war, if you like. And that is quite dramatic because the French have got some massive tanks. And French tanks, one-on-one, infinitely better than German tanks. Sorry if I just indulge on tanks.
No, go for it.
They have got the Sommelier S-35, which is probably the best medium tank of the period. They have got the Charbillon bis, which is a huge monster. One of those got into a scrap with some panzers at a place called Stonne. It was hit 140 times, knocked out 12 German tanks and 2 anti-tank guns, and still came home under its own steam. They're absolute fortresses. But the problem with 1st French Armoured is they're just about out of fuel. So the 5th and 7th Panzer use their mobility, use radio communications, which the French haven't really taken on board that much yet. And as these things are running out of fuel, they are either knocked out by repeated hits or hit by artillery. So Scratch, probably the best unit in the French army. They then move on, and there is, at a place called Avencio Help, there's an encounter battle, and then it's really sort of, it's across country. Rommel is the most extraordinary leader. Down on the Meuse, they're trying to launch a pontoon bridge under fire. The general is down there in the weeds, getting shot at. This is a guy his men really want to follow. They push on forward, and they are steaming across country. It takes the better part of a week, and they are arriving at Arras.
There we go. And that was the lay of the land for the day of the Battle of Arras, the afternoon, early evening, I suppose you could say, of the Battle of Arras in May 1940.
The other units are advancing from Montherm, from Sedan, but Rommel, I mean, they called 7th Panzer the Gespenster Division, the Ghost Division, because not even the Oberkommando de Wehrmacht actually knew where he was. He's advanced so quickly.
And Dr. Chris Parry, at this point, I mean, the Germans must be expecting a counter-attack at some point. And of course, what we'll come on to is explain the counter-attack at Arras. But they were kind of braced for something like this.
The German reconnaissance was really good because they very quickly got command of the air as well. So they were able to put their reconnaissance aircraft out. They were able to support their troops with Stuka dive bombers. And in fact, the control of the air is the critical issue in this advance across France. But what they're not seeing is the movement of the French troops and the British troops back from the River Dyle. They're not being pursued. The German army group in the north there is not actually pursuing them. They're able to come back and join up, they hope, with the French troops in the south. The real problem is the paralysis in the French High Command. General Gamelin, who is in command, he's just not capable of coordinating these vast forces. And it's one of the features of the battle for France is that the French didn't anticipate having this maneuver battle. So with all these moving parts, they didn't actually have generals who could cope with it. And throughout this, we see a collapse in the morale of most of the senior generals. The only one who actually has any credit in this is one Charles de Gaulle, who will enter the fray later. Yeah.
But it's just going back to that. I mean, the whole idea of blitzkrieg, fast-moving armoured columns supported by mechanised infantry, in trucks mostly at this point. Then they smash forward. They are supported by ground attack aircraft, and this is where the Stuka, the Ju-87, comes into its fall. The remaining infantry on foot then mop up what's left. That's the way blitzkrieg actually works.
But they're a long way behind, Chris, I think.
But they are a long way behind.
Yeah.
And Rommel here is way out on a limb. I mean, Churchill says, the tortoise has just stuck its head out of its shell. We're going to chop it off.
And on that note, let's focus in on the Battle of Arras itself. Now, this is really fascinating because this now is a map of Arras and the area around it on the day of the battle, the 21st of May 1940. Now, slightly confusingly, but this is an old map that we've reproduced. Red symbolises the British counterattack, so we're switching the colours round, and the French are in green, and this is the Germans here in the blue. I'm going to start with you, Chris Copson. Before we get into the events of the battle itself, just talk to us about the tanks, because obviously you're from the Tank Museum, you love your tanks, and really this comes down to the Panzers and the Matildas.
Yes, yeah. I mean, everybody thinks about World War II as being, and the German army as being, the Panzerwaffe, the tank arm. But in all honesty, certainly at this period, there are no Tigers, there are no Panthers, nothing like that. German tanks, there's Panzer I, Panzer II. I mean, they're pretty well training vehicles more than anything. They are lightly armoured, Panzer III, yeah, it's got a 37mm gun, but that's not that great. Panzer IV, and there are a few of those around, they are just armed with short-barreled 75mm guns. They're what they call Begleitwagen, so they're support tanks. But Rommel doesn't have many of those at all. He's actually depending on Czech-made T-35 and T-38 tanks, which are essentially they're light to medium tanks. That's the bulk of his kit in 7th Panzer Division. That's what is actually being used at Arras. Now, these guys have covered a huge number of miles. They crossed the Meuse on the 10th, 11th of May. By the 21st, they've done a couple of hundred kilometres. Tanks don't take kindly to that. He's having breakdowns, the track mileage is racking up, and his guys are on their chin straps, to use a military phrase. So they actually pause, and he leaguers, actually goes into a stationary posture to the south of Arras. Arras itself, big First World War battlefield, there's a small British garrison there, but they are not big enough to actually go forth and attack Rommel. So you've got 7th Panzer and also some SS troops, some of the Totenkopf Division, south of Arras. They've stuck their necks out a long way. The Arras corridor stretching all the way back. And as we said previously, this is realised by the Allies, and they think, right, okay, let's see if we can chop the head off Blitzkrieg. So a force is put together. It's called Frankforce, after General Franklin commanding it. 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments, 2 battalions of Durham Light Infantry, and the French 3rd DLM, which is Division Légère Mécanique, which is a light armoured division, components of that. So it's a scratch force that's been put together. They must have had a curious experience, because they come down from the north and they actually leaguer for the night before the attack in and around Vimy. Some of these guys are sleeping in the trenches that were occupied by their fathers in 1917.
Wow.
That's been quite a spooky experience. They then, on the 21st of May, crash down and hit 7th Panzer. They are approaching from the north, and 4th and 7th RTR, each with a battalion of Durham Light Infantry, roll into 7th Panzer. Looping around, the first thing that happens, to be honest, is the SS Totenkopf pretty well run for their lives. They get out of it. They think, this is what's happening. But then the German High Command, especially Rommel, takes charge. The tanks the British are using, light tanks, which aren't really much good. They're designed for reconnaissance. They're not much good at that. They're too loud and quite slow. But we've got Matilda I and Matilda II. These are infantry tanks. They are very heavily armoured. They're meant to take a lot of punishment. Matilda II especially has a 2-pounder gun. Now, everybody rubbishes the 2-pounder. At this time, that can make a mess of most enemy armour. It's only a relatively small weapon, 2-pound shell, but it's high velocity. It's got good kinetic abilities in terms of penetrating armour.
And Chris, I mean, at this time, the Panzer can only hit something at 150 metres, whereas the shell that comes out of a Matilda II, of course, can hit at 500 metres and still penetrate.
Yeah, very much so.
And I think the key thing in this battle is how outgunned and how outranged Panzers are. Everybody thinks the Panzer is wonderful, but actually the French and British tanks, when they engage, as we mentioned earlier, outgun them, outrange them. And of course, the Matilda has got 80 millimetres of armour. It's the most armoured tank on the battlefield.
The saving grace for 7th Panzer is the fact that Matilda is very slow. It's an infantry tank. Yeah. If you really gun it, you can just about get 12 miles an hour out of it. And of course, the Panthers are a lot more fleet of foot than that. But Rommel takes charge, and they have anti-aircraft units with them. And this is where the 88mm gun comes into play. Again, they'd used it as an anti-tank weapon in Poland. High velocity, I mean, a version of this is what's going to go into things like Tiger. But it is just about capable of knocking out Matilda, despite 60mm of armour. So the two attacks basically grind to a halt. They're shot up. The French retire. The British are forced backwards. And this attempt to sever the Arras corridor, to chop the head off Blitzkrieg, has failed.
And we should say, if you love your tanks, the Tank Museum where you were, Chris, is absolutely fantastic. It's in Bovington in Dorset. I remember going there as a teenager. I absolutely loved it. And you've got a great YouTube channel. We'll put a link to the channel in the description of this video. Check it out, because you've got some amazing videos all about it. Now, just show me on the map the events of the day, because this all happens in the space of a few hours, Chris.
Yes.
So the British counterattack with the French. You've obviously got the Germans. Talk me through what the movements are from about, what, 2 o'clock in the afternoon?
Yes, yeah. So the British have leaguered overnight up here at Vimy. Here is Arras. So, as we said, small British garrison. The German troops, 7th Panzer, don't attempt to take Arras. They're swinging round to the south of it, and they're actually holding up here. Then the elements of Frankforce, 4th and 7th RTR, with accompanying infantry, Durham Light Infantry, attack 2 elements sort of swinging down into 7th Panzer.
So 7th RTR here, 4 RTR here, both with a supporting battalion from the Durham Light Infantry.
And some artillery.
And anti-tank stuff.
Anti-tanks. There is, to start off with, there's panic. You've got all these German soldiers. They are absolutely chin-strapped. They are recoiling from what must be a major British counterattack. They think there's several divisions out there, because the whole thing is they've been expecting this all along. They can't believe it's been this easy. Hitler was expecting a long war. He actually has a forward headquarters built with concrete bunkers at a place called Brûlé-de-Pêche, which is in southern Belgium. So he's expecting the war to go on. They can't believe it's been this easy, and this seems to be that big counterattack.
And Dr. Chris Parry, to bring you in, I mean, that's what makes the Battle of Arras so significant. It's the German response, it's the fact that Rommel panics.
Well, it's interesting because there's evidence that the Germans picked up intelligence from communications that what was being planned was a 2-division attack from the north and a 2-division attack from the south. So they're thinking this is what this is. And as we've seen, they're very exposed out here. And it's very difficult to reinforce 7 and 5 Panzer and this Death's Head division from the SS to the south. So they're incredibly worried. And you're absolutely right. Rommel actually says, I'm being attacked by hundreds of tanks. Yep. In his sort of photographic memoir afterwards, he actually says, we were being attacked by 5 divisions. It's actually not true. And it goes all the way back to Hitler and Keitel in the high command. And they think, this is not going well. And indeed, they send Keitel forward to see what's going on. And he says, this has been a self-made crisis. And meanwhile, people like Guderian are saying, look, let's press on. I've got panzer divisions ready to race to the coast. And Hitler at that point says, no, stop. We've got to find out what's really going on here. Let's see what the state of play is. And meanwhile, you've got, as I said, Guderian saying, I've got 1, 2 and 10 panzer here ready to go to Calais, Boulogne and Dunkirk. And they said, no, stop. And Guderian, being Guderian, very much like Rommel in terms of temperament, says, you know what? I will halt, but I'll send some armoured recce up there just to see what's going on. Yeah. Well, of course, you know, that is a reconnaissance in strength. So all the while, the Germans are holding, and they don't get the order to go forward to the Channel until the 23rd, so midnight on the night of the 22nd, 23rd. So this is a major speed bump for the Germans while they sort themselves out. And of course, while that's happening, the German infantry and support elements are coming up behind anyway, while the panzers are using fuel from French petrol stations and arms dumps that they found on the way.
Yeah, and the Battle of Arras itself, I mean, it doesn't last that long. As I mentioned, start about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, finishes, what, early evening?
Yes. Yeah, it's about 4 or 5 hours, effectively.
I mean, James, it's not really a tank battle.
Yeah.
Because essentially the British and French tanks take on the support elements of 7 Panzer and bits of 5 Panzer as well. And the tanks come very late back into the battle in the afternoon, about 4 or 5 o'clock, don't they?
That's it. The armoured element of 7th Panzer is 25th Panzer Regiment, commanded by a guy with a name that echoes down the centuries, Oberst von Bismarck. And they are elsewhere, and they don't get to engage until well into the course of battle.
In late afternoon, as Chris says, you know, the Panzers return. Also, the Luftwaffe makes an appearance at this point with over 300 Stuka sorties. So the British are retreating back to the coast. And what you're ending up with is essentially quite a lot of devastation of the British and the retreating French vehicles. Very few of those tanks survive. In fact, most of them break down, they're set on fire, and the British get out of it as best they can.
But it's the effect of that halt order being issued, and there's a great German word for it, isn't there, Chris?
A Haltbefehl.
Haltbefehl.
Halt order.
Halt order.
Yes.
But it's the effect of that that makes the Battle of Arras so historically significant, and that's what we'll explore now. This is History Undone. OK, now we're into what-if territory now. Let's suppose the Battle of Arras doesn't happen, doesn't work out the way that it did, the halt order isn't issued. The potential historical consequences from that could have been enormous. It's you could say a battle that saved an army because it bought the British a little bit of time. So let's say, Dr. Chris Parry, to start with you, let's say they don't issue the halt order. What does that mean for Dunkirk?
Well, it means that Dunkirk doesn't happen in the way that we saw it did happen. It doesn't present the real morale boost that it has for Churchill and also the whole political establishment and population in Britain. 2 things may have happened here. One is obviously the French and British troops there, 338,000 of them get captured by the Germans.
So these are gone?
Possibly. But given what happened at Arras, it could have been, well, we've got nothing to lose. Why don't we attack? That could have happened as well. So there is an issue there associated with what would that have done to Germans who've been fighting, you know, for a couple of weeks, tired, their maintenance is down, they're out of fuel, they haven't captured much since Arras. So what would have happened then? Well, I suspect the Luftwaffe would have made a heavy appearance at that point. And I'm afraid to say, I think we've ended up with a surrender. But you'd have taken out quite a lot of German troops anyway. Now, had those 338,000 been captured, killed, taken out of action, there are political ramifications. Churchill's only been in post for a couple of weeks. So there's a bit of a problem there because he's known for Gallipoli as a failure in World War I. There may be a move to remove him. Again, Britain may have gritted its teeth and said, well, actually, you know, we've got the Royal Air Force, we've got the Navy, and we're not really concerned about this. And anyway, we've lost the people, but we know we've lost the kit as well. And let's not forget, when we got those troops back from Dunkirk, they didn't bring their kit with them.
Yeah.
So all we would have had is infantry back in the UK.
And the point about morale is really interesting because, of course, it's in the wake of Dunkirk that Churchill delivers that iconic speech, we will fight them on the beaches. That never happens. And the point about Dunkirk is it's basically a defeat, but it becomes a moral victory. But that all goes.
James, I think he would have made the speech.
Do you?
Yeah, because you'd have had to fight them on the beaches if you thought they were going to come. I mean, sea lion itself is a very interesting topic. And we have to bear in mind that after the capture of Norway and Denmark, the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, had been totally devastated. They only had one serviceable U-boat after that campaign, and their surface navy wasn't in a fit state to support anything in the Channel. And I'm of the belief that Sea Lion was put together firstly as a bluff, but also to keep the German Navy occupied, to actually say, look, we'll build you up again. And so at no stage, I think, did they consider this, despite some of the German generals saying, well, actually, it's just a very big river crossing.
Chris Copson, I mean, Operation Sea Lion, which most people will know, but for those who aren't, that's the idea that the Nazi Germany invades mainland Britain.
Yes.
Could that have happened?
As Dr. Chris has been saying, they are making preparations, but they're pretty superficial. I mean, they're using things like river barges and peculiar contraptions with big air engines on the back. I mean, when you think about the amount of time and effort it took to prepare for D-Day, we talked about in the last programme, I don't think that was a viable possibility. If they'd tried it, you get a couple of destroyers, Royal Navy destroyers, loose in that lot. There's going to be an awful lot.
Or a lot of battleships close inshore using their guns. I
think it's difficult to actually. So, I mean, I honestly think that if the Dunkirk evacuation hadn't happened, those troops would have either been killed or captured. They may have tried some sort of last stand, but by this point they've retreated out of Belgium. They are devoid of most of their heavy kit, artillery, tanks. You know, the organisation has, in many cases, broken down. Getting them out is a major feat, and it does give that huge morale boost that enables Churchill to make the speech of speeches about fighting on the beach.
I mean, there's another issue about if you're going to fight it out in Dunkirk, it's almost certain you're going to commit your Hurricane squadrons to actually defend them. So those Hurricanes would have been severely depleted in the event of the Battle of Britain. So there's another issue there that had they decided to fight and use air support from Britain, they're not spending very long over the combat area, we'd have depleted the Royal Air Force. And I'm sure Hugh Dowding would have said there's no way that we want to waste Spitfires, Hurricanes on this, because we might be about to face, obviously, the Luftwaffe attacking us.
Let me throw another what if into the situation. Churchill's position, as you mentioned, this is May 1940. He's only just taken over as Prime Minister. But does he last in post? Does Lord Halifax come in?
May not have done. If Dunkirk had not happened, there would not have been the boost to morale. Churchill's position is tenuous, and it might be thought that, you know, we are not defensible anymore. We don't have an army. So it's possible that somebody like Halifax may have then sued for peace on some sort of terms.
I think that the assessment would have been made, certainly by the military figures in place at the time, that, you know, if you want to come and get us, you can. We've got the Air Force, we've got the Navy, but we don't think you're going to do that. So the army almost is irrelevant at that point if you can't get across the Channel. What I think probably would have happened is we would have come to terms, but on the basis you can't come and get us. So what would that have meant? Hitler probably would have left us with our colonies and also with our Navy, because that's what he did with Vichy France. But he probably would have said, look, I need some assurances that you're not going to come back and bite me again.
So we almost become Vichy Britain.
Vichy Britain, and to what extent that is supportable as Hitler turns east is very interesting. Because how long do we wait? Because let's face it, the Americans wouldn't have entered the war had it not been for Pearl Harbor. Would they have supported us? Would they have wanted to actually invade mainland Europe after seeing all this happen? Remember, Joseph Kennedy, the ambassador in London at the time, is saying, well, Britain's not going to hold out. And a lot of people are believing him, and that will give a tremendous boost to the isolationists in America at the time, because Roosevelt's desperately trying to do something about what is happening in Europe. He's helping us, of course, by this stage, very surreptitiously. They're helping us in the Atlantic, but this will give a tremendous boost to the isolationists who say there's no way we're getting involved in the European war. It's over.
I mean, that is fascinating, and this is where it's a proper sliding doors moment.
This is the thing. if Britain is out of the war, is neutral, disarmed to a certain extent. I mean, Hitler didn't. You always get the impression he didn't really want to take us on.
Yeah.
The idea of the empire remaining intact, you know, it's us in place rather than perhaps somebody else like the Japanese taking over.
I mean, it's interesting, if you look at the way he treated the French, he deliberately said that. I don't want the Americans, the Japanese and the others actually making hay while the French are defeated. So it's likely he would have done that with us.
But what it actually means, of course, is that it's almost impossible for the United States to intervene in Europe without this aircraft carrier.
Yes, because they can't station troops here.
No, and an invasion, a D-Day type invasion from the other side of the Atlantic, no, not really.
So are we saying that the Americans don't get involved in the war at all? Potentially because of the consequences of the Battle of Arras?
No, not quite, because we've got to remember that Germany is allied to Japan later on. Now, I'm of the view that the Japanese would have had quite free play in the Pacific. If you remember, the Dutch are taken out, the French are taken out, the Brits are taken out in these circumstances. They don't have to apply much military force in the Pacific, except in terms of provoking the Americans in relation to what's going on in the Philippines, in China and other places like that. But I think we can stick our neck out and say the Japanese wouldn't have had to do Pearl Harbor.
Really?
So Pearl Harbor doesn't happen. The Germans, the Americans don't enter the war on that pretext. The whole Germany first agenda disappears. And if there is an issue, the Americans are facing into the Pacific and saying, what are the Japanese up to? How can we contain them?
And of course, the other element is
Russia.
Well, let's talk about the situation in the East, because I suppose if Hitler doesn't have to worry about America pursuing a Germany first policy, he's in complete control of Central and Western Europe. He can focus his attention on the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, Dr. Chris Parry, could that have worked in this scenario?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at the original documents, you'll see that the first plan for Barbarossa was to do a double envelopment, which went basically up past the Baltic states and through Ukraine to the south. Two very strong army groups. But I'm afraid to say the German Army High Command got windy about it. General Halder in particular said, look, we can't leave our flanks exposed. And again, it's this neurosis from the Germans about their flanks that really bedevils some of their strategy. And he says, we must have an army group centre. And so they strip out elements of both Army Group North and South to form Army Group Centre. They then have the distraction of having to invade Greece because the Italians have messed it up. That delays them for 6 to 8 weeks. But it is critical that the troops that they've had to leave in the West because of Britain and the fact the Americans might intervene at any stage means they've got lots of troops there that could have formed that Army Group Centre. And I'm confident, looking at the laydown in Russia, that it would have completely rolled over the Russians, encircled them, and I think Moscow would have been captured.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the amount of men and material that not having a worry in the West would have given Hitler, Barbarossa could have become a crushing blow.
Yeah.
I mean, Russia is a very, very big place, but the whole of White Russia would have fallen. They'd have chased them back to the Urals, I think.
I think
the whole thing.
Absolutely.
The thing that's going to grind to a halt eventually is just distance, the sheer
overreach.
depth of the country, overreach.
Yeah.
But that could well have been the scenario that we were looking at.
And what's interesting, James, here is had he achieved that, there are indications that, and there's a book by Brendan Sims that says at that point he would have taken on America. Having actually got this huge economic, social...
He's in control of pretty much all of Europe, so he feels he can take on the US.
He's got a huge economic...
And he's got Moscow at this point, we're saying.
And energy base here that he then can project against the Americans. And there are indications in quite a lot of the literature that that was what he was intending to do. What's really interesting here, of course, is look at what's happening today. We've got Russia, China dominating Eurasia. So all the resources that Hitler probably would have relied on to actually project outwards and consolidate his power are in the hands of totalitarian powers today. With China reaching through with its Belt and Road Initiative, you've got Russia obviously slightly allied with China, that whole ability to hold what the geopolitical theorist Mackinder says is the world island is absolutely critical. But the good news for all of us is that maritime alliances always defeat continental alliances, as was seen in World War II.
I can't ignore this red bloc in Moscow. So this means that the Soviet Union has been defeated. We spoke about the implications for Churchill personally. What's this mean for Joseph Stalin, Chris?
He may have held out. As we said, the sheer depth of the country, it's unlikely they could have got much further. But most of what is actually useful in Russia is up this end. You want tundra, permafrost, stuff like that.
So he either retreats into Siberia.
Well, no, not quite that far, and that's a lot of time zones, James. I mean, basically, what you do have to remember is, in the face of the German onslaught, quite a lot of the machinery, factories, and processes are taken to the east of the Urals.
They'd had the time. I mean, they did amazing stuff. I mean, they built an entire new city, Chelyabinsk, Dunkirk, so that, which is east of the Urals, 1,000 kilometres away, so they could carry on turning out T-34s without German bombers intervening. But that actually meant there was sufficient time to actually do that. If the German advance had been that rapid and really smashed into the vitals of
and
Western
encircled
Russia,
their main army groups.
the chances are that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, the other thing, of course, is if we, the UK, are out of the game, there's no Arctic convoys taking supplies to Russia via Murmansk, nothing coming across the Atlantic to support it.
Probably nothing coming from the United States either.
But you've got Vladivostok. Japan isn't at war with Russia, so you're probably getting stuff in through the Pacific. Is that sufficient? Is that realistic in terms of what American interests would be at that point? I mean, the critical thing is, and we're in the same situation today, America's eyes would have been turned to the Pacific, away from Europe. It's amazing how history rhymes in these senses.
I want to go back to the US in just a moment and also touch briefly on Italy. But just to be clear, if we're saying the Soviet Union has been defeated, Joseph Stalin has either retreated or he's been captured, say. I mean, you could have a situation in which Joseph Stalin is living in a luxury prisoner of war camp somewhere in Germany. That's not completely outside the realms of possibility. What about Roosevelt as well? Does he get re-elected?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, a lot of Roosevelt's success has been based on the New Deal. And here's the thing. The New Deal only works economically because America is able to go to war in 1941.
Yeah.
So if you don't go to war in 1941, how would the New Deal, the whole experiment in the way you do economic planning like that, have worked? So he may have been re-elected, he may not have been. But the whole trajectory for America, which basically it becomes the arsenal of democracy but makes a lot of money out of it, by 1945, it is the hyperpower in the world. That probably doesn't happen.
Yeah. And Chris Copson, Mussolini in Italy, what's he up to now?
Slightly difficult to predict. He would always try to have been, on the winning side. It's rather like he doesn't actually jump in on the side of Germany until things appear to be ineradicably going Hitler's way.
He's really annoyed not to be invited to the armistice in Compiègne in the railway carriage. He has a hissy fit.
And, I mean, he's still got eyes, obviously, on the Mediterranean, on Musso's Pond. But whenever they try anything over there, in Greece, in North Africa, mainly British soldiers frustrate them. British soldiers aren't there. They may have had more success. They may have managed to sever Suez Canal. That would, of course, disrupt the empire in a major way. I mean, these are distant ripples in the pond, really. But I think what's fairly certain is Mussolini would have been very much wanting to be on the winning side, so he's going to be sucking up.
And ideologically, I mean, he's a fascist.
He's a fascist.
He's got
the original fascists.
Yeah. So I mean, what's interesting, of course, you've got Finland is on the side of the Germans after their winter war with the Soviet Union, which they did very well, but of course it eventually got defeated. But it's an interesting situation where you essentially, if you're Hitler, you've delivered what you said you'll do in Mein Kampf.
And you mentioned the ripples in the pond. I mean, that really is what History Undone is all about. We've looked at the Battle of Arras, a relatively unknown Quite short battle in May 1940, but from that, we could potentially say Dunkirk never happens. The British Army is effectively wiped out. Churchill's position is completely undermined. Let's say Britain then has to sue for peace, is neutral. America doesn't enter the war, well, certainly doesn't do the Germany first policy. Hitler can focus on the East. Operation Barbarossa is a success. Joseph Stalin is deposed. These are massive geopolitical consequences, the effects of which we would still be living with today. And that is History Undone. My thanks, as ever, to Dr. Chris Parry and Chris Copson for joining me. If you like this video, please do watch, share, subscribe, and join us next time for History Undone.